Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Father, once again, we thank you for this night and for our time together. Thank you for each one of these precious men and their love for you, for their families, the gifts that you've given to them. We thank you for your word and just for the ability that you've given us to hopefully rightly divide it. We pray tonight as we study about some of these different terms that we're looking at that are hazards to the interpretive process. We pray that you would just give us wisdom and grace as we migrate our way through all of these things. We thank you for your love and your faithfulness to us. Father, we are just so grateful for everything that you have provided for us. This is a great salvation, and you are a great God. And so we come to you and we just want to rest our life in your presence, just bow down to you, to worship you, just fall at your feet and just say thank you. And so we pray that your Spirit would come into this room tonight and minister to us now. In Jesus' precious name, amen. All right, tonight I want to begin talking about what's known as syncretism, S-Y-N-C-R-E-T-I-S-M, syncretism. Syncretism, I think, is something that we ought to all be a little bit familiar with, maybe not in denominationally or such, but syncretism is when you combine different religions and different cultures and different ideas and different practices and varying beliefs to help create, we could call it a new religion, or even what I would call a new philosophical format. Obviously, we have a lot of different philosophies, right? And some of those philosophies become religions. You could take the New Age movement, for instance. Even humanism, I think, could be considered as sort of a religion, man worshiping himself. And so all of that would fall under the idea of syncretism. The problem with syncretism is that it is often seen and identified as a way of creating what some people call an interfaith dialogue. I think that in our day and age that Rick Warren has done that with his creation of what he calls Chrislam, which is a syncretism of Christianity with Islam, with the Islamic faith. So it's the fusion, the combining, the integrating of different beliefs and different practices that ultimately create a new religion that is distinct from what we would consider to be biblical Christianity. And so it is if you take something like Chrislam, it is I have no idea as to how far it will go, but his purpose was to take sort of the best of both and to find some common ground between the two. For instance, both religions believe in the Old Testament. They believe in the prophets of the Old Testament. So it's the idea that maybe we can find some common ground, and in that common ground we can find something that's meaningful to both sides, with the two completely very differing views. So I think it should be an obvious deduction that syncretism is not something that can be reconciled with the teachings of Scripture. It's not something that I personally, I'll put it that way, that I personally can reconcile with what I know about the New Testament. In the New Testament, there was a merging of, in the New Testament times, there was always a merging of different ideas and different cultures, different beliefs from those cultures. There was a merging of ideas that were drawn from what we would call the mystery religions, the sort of the Oriental religions of that day. They called them mystery religions. We had Judaism, we had Christianity, we had all kinds of Greek philosophical concepts. It's not hard for me to believe in that kind of environment that you can have something, say, like Gnosticism that developed. Gnosticism was sort of a mystical kind of combination of a little bit of everything that tried to be something and ultimately wound up being nothing. And so historically, syncretism, just from a historical perspective, syncretism has flourished when nations have gone in and conquered other nations. We see that a lot in the Old Testament, right? When the people when they were taken off by the Assyrians, or when they were taken off by the Babylonians. You know, when the nation of Israel was removed by the Babylonians, only a very small percentage of them ever came back to their native land. They didn't. It wasn't like after 70 years, oh, we'll all go back. This hasn't been this long. It was like that generation had sort of passed away. Everybody had been absorbed into their new surroundings. They had intermarried. They had accepted the beliefs. The reason that they even went and were removed by God and taken off by the Babylonians is because they basically had rejected the biblical God that they worshipped. They had bought into the false gods of Baal and Ashtaroth and all of those things that created the environment for God to remove them. And he did it. He did it twice, actually, between the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And so invariably over a period of time, the different cultures that you become intertwined with become it normalizes. People begin to accept it. I think that we're seeing that here in America. The problem with the term that's used is, what's the term when countries allow a lot of other countries to come into their country?
Refugees.
No.
Assimilating or something?
Yeah, it's something like that. Assimilating is not the word I'm looking for. I'll think of it in just a minute when I'm not thinking about it. But it was an experiment that happened in Europe, and now some of the countries in Europe have actually reversed that process because it was so detrimental. And the reason it's detrimental is that when you allow another culture to come in, they bring their culture with them. When the Muslims come, they build mosques. When the Buddhists come, they build temples. Yes?
I was going to say, Australia, I think.
Yes.
Told them
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. They did. And I'm not trying to be critical of the other cultures or even the other religions. What I'm saying is that over a period of time, that syncretism actually takes place, and one of the ways that it works its way into the culture is through intermarriage. We see a lot of intermarriage today between people of different races, different cultures, and you create an environment for syncretism to actually take place. And I think historically, this is when syncretism has happened the most, when countries have been dominated, they've been overrun, in the Old Testament, when the Greek culture or the Roman culture would go in and capture somebody, Babylonian culture, they would take some of their people and put them into the land that they had conquered, and then they would take the people they had conquered and move them out into their regions for the very purpose of neutralizing them, of neutralizing their beliefs and their religions, and they were very successful at that. So I think it happens a lot when we intermarry from one culture to another. I think it happens in sort of a compromising way when, like people in America, they intermarry is not the right word, they marry into other beliefs or other faiths. It'd be like a Baptist marrying a Mormon, right? Something has to happen. The children are going to go to some church, and it most likely it's going to be to the Mormon church, all right? And so that is sort of an idea of syncretism, where you get absorbed into that particular religion. So anytime a country is involved in the intermarriages of different cultures, between different cultures, there will be an infusion into that culture of different religions. There will be an intermarriage of the religions and a combination of them, or a weakening of the ones that are there. And so what the intermarriages did historically was that they created an environment for what we might call, I'll use this term, for a religious compromise. And the compromise takes place. I don't know if I'll get to it tonight, but I've been studying on some other things and doing some research to give you statistics that I think will sort of emphasize this as we go through our study tonight. So the compromise happens when one partner wants to accommodate the other person's religious beliefs. And so let's say somebody has a fundamental, foundational type of evangelical Christianity, and they marry somebody that's not a believer, or somebody that comes from another religious background. Maybe they marry somebody from the Middle East. I'm not against Middle East people. There's going to be a fusion of ideas. There's going to be a fusion of different kinds of faith that are going to be apparent. One of the ways that Dr. Ildefonso and I saw this in Indonesia was that we were in the eastern side of Indonesia, and the western side was the most heavily populated Islamic community in the world. And then on the eastern side, which used to be Papua New Guinea, used to be called Irian Jaya, I think, and then it was New Guinea. Then it divided up into Papua New Guinea and to where we were. It's called Papua Indonesia. And so what happened is that the Christians migrated to Papua. That's what they call it, Papua Indonesia. They migrated there. And what happened is that the Islamic faith migrated with them. But what the Islamic faith brought with them is that they brought money. And so the way that they were a minority. The Islamic faith was a minority in the Christian community. In fact, the revival that took place in Indonesia was remarkable. There's a wonderful book written about it called Fire on the Mountains, if you ever get a chance to read it. And I spoke with one, I actually met one of the men who was one of the missionaries to that region during that time, when thousands and thousands of the tribal people came to Christ during that time. And I've been to some of those tribes. The guy that was our host was actually from one of those tribes, His father had gotten saved, he got saved, the tribe got saved. And it was kind of a neat thing to see. But the way that the Islamic faith worked is that they realized that they had much more money than the Christians did, and that the Christians, there were a lot of things that the Christians could not afford. And one of them was a good education. So what they did is that they came in and they built schools. And they said, if you want your children to come to school, get a good education, we have computers, we have new facilities, they're much better than where you go, your children can come for free. And so they allowed the children, the Christians allowed the children to go to the Islamic schools, and while they were there, they taught them of the Islamic faith. And so you can imagine the impact that that had a couple of generations, or at least just one generation down the road. The Christians lost their children. They lost their children to the Islamic faith. And so there was a huge compromise that took place in all of that. And their children began to intermarry with those from the Islamic faith. And so, then to make matters even worse, oftentimes the gospel is taken to other cultures. It's taken to other cultures. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. But some of the religious beliefs that are in those cultures, some of the practices that are an integral part of the culture, in the indigenous culture in which somebody is going to, those practices still remain. This happens all the time in Africa, where the gospel is taken into a region, but in that region, and it's preached, it's accepted, but there are certain unbiblical elements that are allowed to remain. The number of times that I've been to Africa, you can go into a predominantly, you can go into an area that predominantly is not Christian, and people are very receptive to the gospel in those areas. You can preach the gospel, people will come to Christ, and then you can come back a couple of years later and you realize that they have retained their witch doctors. They still will practice a form of voodoo that they just never got rid of, and they integrate that into their culture. They don't have health facilities. They don't have good hospitals. They don't have medicine like we do. So the medicine doctor just stays with them, right? So when they have problems, when they have issues, they go to the witch doctor. They see him as a benefit that they didn't want to get rid of, and it stays as a part of their religious setting. If you went to Haiti, you would find that many of the Christians there are still very impacted by voodoo. It's a very normal part of the religious practices of Haiti, especially in these second and third world countries. Let's take an example. One example would be the religious system called Christian Science, right? We have a Christian Science place here. You go down the street, and it's got a church, right? They call it a church. Well, it's neither Christian and it's neither scientific. It's neither one of the two. Then I think the one that's probably the most prominent in the age in which we live is called the New Age movement. It's been around for a good while. I don't know exactly how long that it's been here, but it has people like Oprah Winfrey, who is sort of their spokesperson today. She's come on the scene in the last 15 years or so, and she has formed what is known as the Church of Oprah, and she calls it O, the Church of Oprah. It's what it's called. And I think that her first church was started in Chicago. They filled it up the first day that it was opened, and it spawned a new religion that she calls O, the Oprah religion. Now here's the sad part about it. is that she has always professed faith in Christ. So she'll use words that are similar to words that we might use, but unfortunately it's not the same Christ as you and I believe in. This is the way, I'm going to read to you this is the way that she describes Christ. She says that Christ was a good man, but she does not encourage actual church attendance. She says that's not even necessary to be a part of a local church. If you don't want to come, you can just stay at home and watch me on TV. Because she has a television program where she actually does that. And her spiritual mentor was a guy by the name of Eckhart Tolle. He's a New Age teacher, and he is a New Age author. He's a prolific writer on the New Age, and he preaches a spiritual awakening that he describes as the next step in human evolvement. The evolvement of the human mind, this mysticism. They want you to get to a place where you're not thinking, where you're just sort of absorbing the universe. I didn't do enough reading on it to really talk about it, but it's simply Eastern mysticism that's been reinvented and adapted to a Western culture. So they've taken the beliefs of well, if this wasn't important, we probably wouldn't be talking about it. But the problem is that every one of these movements generate tremendous revenue. They generate tremendous interest, and they draw people into them from other churches that are dissatisfied with churches. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And so they believe in a supreme power of some kind, but it's not the Creator God that we studied about for the last 2 hours in the other class. In our textbook, I think this is really interesting. Klein uses the example of Jeroboam. Everybody remembers who Jeroboam was. When the kingdom, when Solomon died, Jeroboam went to Rehoboam and asked him if he would soften all of the demands that Solomon had made on the men. He took them away from their families for nearly 6 months out of the year to go build all of his monstrosities and his vineyards and his temples or whatever he built, his houses and his cities. And he taxed the people. So the men were away from their families. They were overtaxed. They were burdened. They were overworked. And he said, just soften that. Rehoboam goes to his friends. He refuses to do that. And so the kingdom splits. And 10 of the tribes go with Jeroboam, and the other 2, or however many it was, came down to the southern kingdom. So what Jeroboam did is that he created 2 worship sites, one at Bethel and one at Ai. Ai was at the northern part of the kingdom, and Bethel was right at the line that split the southern kingdom from the northern kingdom. It was probably only, 25, 30 miles away from Jerusalem itself. It was right there in that same vicinity. Because he didn't want people to go down, he didn't want their heritage to draw them down to Jerusalem, so he created a new religion. It had a priesthood, it had a temple, it had an altar, it had sacrifice, it had everything that Judaism had. But so he maintained a lot of parts of Judaism. He maintained it, but he introduced golden cows that people worshipped, and he incorporated many of the other pagan practices to keep the people in his kingdom. It was syncretism. He just took a little bit of everything that surrounded him and came up literally with a new religion. I said Ai, it was Dan and Bethel. And so this syncretism happens all the time when Christians begin to blend in the philosophical ideas of the culture in which they live. I think we're seeing this today with what is called the emergent church. It has a completely different approach to scriptures. It's created its own Bible called the Message Bible, which is really, in my mind, not a Bible. It's a paraphrase. We have blended this idea of positive thinking, and the paradigm shift to what we'd call cultural preferences. I think Rick Warren did that when he developed Saddleback Sam. What do you want in a church? So he goes around and he asks lost people, what would you like to have in a church? And they say, well, you know, and he gave them the Saddleback Sam sort of 25, 30 questions. You know, what kind of music do you want to hear? What kind of message? How long do you want the message to be? What do you want to dress like? What do you want the pastor to do? What kind of environment do you want? So he created a new kind of religious system that has not only been adopted, it took off like wildfire. Baptist churches are trying to imitate that pragmatic approach that he had to the gospel, to the message, to church, as a means of reaching people. And now we have emergent churches. Bill Hybels did it. Where we live, there's what's called the Elevation Church that's up in Charlotte.
Furtick.
Yeah, Stephen Furtick. And if you go into those churches, it's almost a carnival atmosphere. The preachers it's syncretism. It's going out into the culture and bringing into the church cultural ideas and cultural preferences and philosophies. One of the churches in Los Angeles is called the Mosaic. It's the guy that is the pastor there. What's his name? I can't remember, but he went to Southwestern, got a degree in a master's degree in divinity. It was a theological degree, and then he goes to Duke and he gets a degree. I think it was Duke. He goes to Duke and gets a degree in philosophy. So he has merged, or psychology, not philosophy. He gets a degree in psychology. So he has merged psychology with theology. It's syncretism. And he created this church called the Mosaic. And I think it is just a good example of how easily this can happen around us. We take somebody like John Maxwell. Everybody knows who John Maxwell is, or should. He's a well-known teacher that teaches on principles of leadership. And so what he has developed is a religion of what we might call self-help, where he introduces all of these, all of his leadership principles, and I know I'll get in trouble for saying this, but many people that are probably my age sort of grew up on the radio program by Norman Vincent Peale was sort of the disciple of Norman Vincent Peale was the guy that had the Crystal Palace out in California. I forget what his name was. Schuller, yeah, Robert Schuller. And after he died, his son took over, and then the whole thing just failed. They didn't have any foundation for biblical teaching. But many families grew up on the teachings of James Dobson. And I love James Dobson. I think he's a wonderful Christian, but he integrated, if you would listen to his program, that there wasn't a lot of biblical teaching, if any at all. it was based on psychology and you know, how to raise children from a kind of a psychological, or have a good marriage. And so what he did is that he merged worldly teachings into the fabric of everybody that was listening to him. And it became, there was a period of time there where it became a major part of sort of the Christian community. The books that he wrote had a great influence. I read a bunch of them. I mean, it impacted me personally. And so what happens is that all of these ideas that may not be biblical, they may be psychological, they may be philosophical, they may have some religious overtones to them, they all get assimilated without us actually realizing it. We hear it on the TV, I mean, you hear it on the radio, we listen to it, we buy the books, we read it, and the next thing you know, it becomes sort of a part of the Christian environment. It's accepted. Doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that in every case that it's actually wrong. Did you have a question?
Oh, sure.
Okay. And so we take these philosophical elements, the ideas of positive thinking. I think that we integrate sometimes the scientific elements into our culture.
So it's allowing the culture to impress itself.
I said that again?
It's allowing the culture to impress itself upon the Christian walk. You know, because we have that verse that says, be in the world, not of the world, but it seems like it's a direct contradiction to that, to be in the world and of the world, and allowing the world to impress itself with its ideologies and its culture into the church and into the Christian walk.
Sure. I think it happens all the time. There are many cultural views that have been assimilated into the fabric of the cultural church, if I want to call it that, today. It's a bigger movement than, I say movement, but it's a bigger issue than we actually realize. And I think the ultimate problem with syncretism is that what it does, and I want you to listen very carefully to the way I'm going to say this. The ultimate problem with syncretism is that it introduces what Paul defined in Galatians chapter 1 as another gospel. It's another teaching, it's another philosophy, it's another psychological kind of development within the church, and it just has a tendency over a period of time to weaken the church. I think that you can see this, you can readily see this in what today is called the seeker-sensitive movement, right? It's a very popular movement. It certainly seems to have more of an impact on people than does just the traditional church teachings and the traditional approaches that we have.
So it's kind of like the Gnosticism of today.
Well,
just that false teaching that is just not in complete alignment with the gospel truth.
It's not. It's almost like the problem with the seeker-sensitive movement is that they're not willing to call anybody a sinner. They call them seekers. I mean, that's how it got started. It got started with Bill Hybels, actually, and not Rick Warren. Rick Warren was more of a disciple of. He studied Bill Hybels' methods and he went out and implemented them as best he could. So, but in an effort, I think, to be culturally relevant and in an environment that's willing to foster new ideas and integrate new ideas into its fabric, there's often, in a seeker-sensitive movement, there's oftentimes very little of what we would consider to be a true gospel transformation in the lives of the individuals. They come for the experience. They come for the music. They don't come for the message. And even when they do get the message, it's not necessarily a biblical message. It's a message that's surrounded with Bible verses. But it's not a true teaching a lot of times of the Scriptures. I don't want to overstate that. I'm sure that there's some churches where the pastors are really good. I remember when I went to Texas to be with my son, and I went to what I considered to be an emergent church, and everything about it was very relaxed. It was a very, they had a donut shop, they had coffee. You could get, people would get up during the service, during the preaching of the word, and go outside and get donuts and coffee and bring it back in to the service. It had all the music and the big screens. It didn't have a smoke machine, thank goodness, a fog machine, whatever they call it. And the pastor came out, and he had an iPad. He was wearing tennis shoes, blue jeans. He had on one of those shirts that hang out, all that. And I'm just sitting there thinking, well, this is not good. I'm probably not going to enjoy this. But he taught on John chapter 3, from verse 17 on, and it was outstanding. It was hermeneutically correct. It was biblically correct. And I left. I left saying this was a good thing. That the Word of God, and he didn't water it down for his congregation. He taught it, and he did a very good job of it. And I was I thought to myself, I said, I'll be glad if my son goes here. It will be okay with me, because I believe he's going to hear the Word of God. So I think that this can sort of be defined as syncretism in our culture, this seeker-sensitive type movement that has become a part of a lot of churches. There are probably some churches that need to change, right? There's some churches that are just dead. I don't know if that's an oxymoron, probably. And there are churches that are ineffective. There are churches that are not teaching the Word of God. The pastors aren't trained. But the influence of how something like the seeker-sensitive movement, how to quantify its influence is not something that can be easily measured. It's just not something that I can measure. I don't think Barna can measure it today. Maybe in 25 or 50 years from now, when the traditional church is gone and we have a lot of these seeker-sensitive churches, it may be easier at that time. And I think what this kind of cultural message does to the actual gospel is that it creates a gospel that removes the individual's dependency on Christ. It's a sort of a self-help religion. It's sort of a what can we do to help you type religion. What would you enjoy kind of religion? What kind of facilities do you want? What do we have to do to sort of make you happy? And so it removes this dependency on Christ, and ultimately, I think it removes His lordship over our lives as it continues to evolve, right? This is something that syncretism does not take place in a year. It doesn't take place in 2 years or 5 years. It takes probably a generation or two, at least, for it to get assimilated out into the fabric of the local church and to make an impact on it. So, in kind of a negative way. And then to make the situation even more serious, the effort to make the message of the Bible acceptable to the listener, to the seeker, right? What happens is that the message gets softened. It gets softened. The Scriptures make demands on us as believers. And so when the message gets softened, the theological truths that are embedded in those demands get lost. They get removed. That's why they're willing to create a Bible that's a paraphrase, that's not based on academic research. It doesn't have academic integrity to it. And yet you can imagine that under that scenario, that the truths of the Bible, the rich truths of the Bible, will be lost just for the concept of being able to communicate better. And I'm all for communication, right? I'm all for clarification, but not at the expense of losing the truths that are there. So I think if the church kind of over-engages itself in what we've called in the development of this course, if the church over-engages in what we call contextualization and relevancy, right? Those are two words that you ought to understand what we're talking about here. If the church gets over-engaged in contextualization and becoming relevant to all of its listeners, what's going to happen, I think, and I think that's exactly what has happened in the emergent church movement, is that the developing problem will be that of actually diminishing and ultimately losing the gospel message itself. It's going to be a loss of the gospel. The gospel is not going to be clear anymore. It's going to be what do I have to do? What can I do? It's going to be sort of a self-help type of gospel. And I think the byproduct of all of that is that the church will create false conversions. That's the worst part of it, is that there will be many false conversions within these particular churches. So for me, as a pastor, even as a professor, this takes there's a very delicate balance here as to how we handle syncretism in our midst. It's all around us, whether or not we want it. Remember the illustration I gave of one of our local churches that had a billboard down the road here? And the billboard had 3 signs, and they all turned. Everybody remember that? The first one was a pastor riding on a red motorcycle, and all it said was, "Our pastor." No, pastor, that's all it said. Or church pastor was the words. Then it rotates, and then there's a guy with a guitar and blue jeans. He's a good friend of mine. And I used to go to church with him, and he was very talented. And he's just sitting there playing the guitar, and it says church music. And then the next one flips, and there's a pair of blue jeans. That's all it is, a pair of blue jeans. And it says church clothes. There's not one word about Christ. There's not one word about the gospel. It's just, if you go to our church, you'll like it. You'll like our dress. You'll like our relaxed atmosphere. It doesn't say anything about Christ in that. And so, to me, that's contextualization, right? Understand what I just said? That's a form of contextualizing that's sort of outside, I think, of the boundaries of what we should be doing as a church. And so, what all of that contextualization does is that it actually hides and it obscures the very message that we have been entrusted with to preach and to teach. It hides it under relevance and under significance, and it's very, very dangerous. There's a real important balance here, so that we don't obscure the message. I want you to go, if you would, to 2 Kings chapter 17. Got a Bible? Turn there in the 2 Kings chapter 17. And I want to read just one example of blatant syncretism in the Old Testament. It's in 2 Kings chapter 17. I'm going to begin with verse 29. I'm sorry, I forgot. It says, however, every nation continued to make gods of its own, and put them in the shrines on the high places which the Samaritans had made. every nation in the cities where they dwelt. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima, and the Avites made Nebhaz and Tartak, and the Sevarbites burned their children in fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. So they feared the Lord. And from every class they appointed for themselves priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. They feared the Lord, yet served their own gods, according to the rituals of the nations from among whom they were carried away. To this day, they continue practicing the former rituals. I mean, we have a whole list of gods here that they serve. And they brought those religious practices, they never got rid of them. And they do not fear the Lord, nor do they follow their statutes, or their ordinances, or the law and commandments which the Lord had commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel, with whom the Lord had made a covenant, and charged them, saying, You shall not fear other gods, nor bow down to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But the Lord, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm, him you shall fear, him you shall worship, and to him you shall offer sacrifice. And the statutes, the ordinances, the law, and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall be careful to observe forever. You shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. But the Lord your God you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of all of your enemies. However, they did not obey, but they followed their former rituals. So these nations feared the Lord, yet served their carved images. Also their children and their children's children have continued doing as their fathers did, even to this day. This is syncretism at its best. This is how to lose your children. This is how to lose your children. Adopt all the ideas that the world has, bring it into the church. Become like the world, right? And this is syncretism at its worst, or at its best, whatever you want to call it. This is the blending of the worship of Yahweh in the Old Testament with the worship of Baal and other pagan gods. They brought the priest in from these other religions so that they could still make sacrifices at their various altars. And this is when the elements of a pagan religion, with all of its unbiblical beliefs and all of its unbiblical practices, are incorporated into the Bible's saving message. Chrislam. Chrislam will find a footing. Trust me, it will find a footing in America. This is a wonderful place. Freedom of religion, right? You go into some other countries in the world, there is no melting of other religions into their religions. They do not allow it. They will kill you if you. Certain countries, which one is it? They will put you in jail forever if you bring a Bible into their country. Well, Saudi Arabia. I have a guy in my church that went to Saudi Arabia, and he knows, he understands. So, syncretism does not happen overnight. Just appreciate that. It's not something that you're just going to find, one day you're okay and the next day you're not. I think it may take several generations. And the enemy is perfectly satisfied with it's taking that long. He's perfectly satisfied. He doesn't care about you. He cares about your children. If he can get your children, I'm going to give you some statistics here in a little bit under another topic that are just frightening to me. They're absolutely frightening. They're numbers that Barna has developed over a period of probably 20 years. on a lot of different areas. So I call it, in the notes I've actually highlighted it, I've called it an unbiblical cultural shift. Don't you see that happening today? Yes or no? An unbiblical cultural shift. I'm not a politician. I don't want to get into politics. It's a moving from the right to the left, right? Being conservative to being very liberal. It's a moral shift. We'll talk about the moral shift here in one of the other topics. It's a cultural shift that's happening. And the problem is that when the culture moves very slowly into another area, the church has a tendency to follow. The church is not getting stronger. The church is getting weaker as this cultural shift actually takes place. And the cultural shift is moving further and further away from God's standards, as well as from the gospel message. That's the problem. We've weakened the message. We made it seeker sensitive. We've done away with sinners, right? I don't want to go, and every time somebody comes in my church to point my finger and say, well, you're a sinner, you're going to go to hell. That's not the message. That's not the method, right? But we are afraid to confront the culture, in the culture in which we live. I would say that if I read the scriptures, and even a place like we read here in 2 Kings, I would say this to you. It seems that the clear message of the scriptures is that the more that syncretism takes place in the church, that it will eventually lead to God's judgment on the church. And so we want to be very, very careful here. I think in America, these are going to sort of hit home to us, that one of the obvious examples of syncretism are in our holidays called Easter and Christmas. Right? Here we are, we're in the Christmas season. Easter is packed with all kinds of symbols, all kinds of pagan symbols that the church has adopted. On Easter, you can go out and find, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. I got to say that. I've been through it. I'm not in favor of it. I'm just not going to die on this hill. But it's packed with practices, with rituals that have been incorporated from Greek and Roman cultures and celebrations that surrounded what were known as spring fertility. They were these pagan practices related to fertility. And the pagan practices of the worship of the goddess of Ishtar, I-S-H-T-A-R, she was the fertility goddess, have been incorporated into the Christian culture, into the Christian celebration. There are plenty of churches on Easter where you can go and they're looking for these Easter eggs, right? That are outside. And now they don't use the eggs, they use the little plastic things that have toys in them. And then we have Christmas. Christmas was invented as a substitute for what was known as a pagan Yule celebration that worshiped the sun god on December the 25th. Obviously, Jesus was not born on December the 25th. He was probably born in late September or early October through all research. And so these two celebrations, they're packed with pagan practices. We got Santa Claus, and they've been synchronized into the fabric of Christianity in America. And we can't get rid of them, right? I mean, we can't get rid of them. I'm not opposed to Christmas. I'm not opposed to worshiping Christ. But I know this, that there's not one single place in the Bible that teaches that we are to worship the baby Jesus. we're to worship the risen Lord. And I think there's a difference. So we just incorporate it, and now it's not something that we're going to get rid of. It's a part of the church. We have cantatas, we have all kinds of, I'm not against the music, I'm not trying to say stop everything. I'm just saying it's something that we can't, it's here. It's here. And unless you just want people to shoot you, if you oppose it, they'll kick you out of the church, right? I mean, could you imagine just stopping those celebrations because of their pagan practices, what it would do?
Are there any churches that do celebrate Christ's birth in September, December timeframe? I mean, September, October?
I don't know if they should. That's the whole point.
Okay.
I want to serve.
The risen Lord.
I want to work. He's the one I want to worship. Easter would be more of a legitimate time to do it. I'm just saying that Christmas was invented as a substitute for a pagan celebration. It's like we want to keep up with the Joneses, if I can say it that way.
And now it's in most churches, if you don't preach around the Christmas message, then they're going to have problems too. I mean, that was something that I specifically encountered, because it was like, oh, that's not a Christmas message, because you're preaching on the family, and we tied it in. But at the end of the day, that's the culture that we live in. It's not just about celebrating the time of year. It's about everything being geared towards what the culture has accepted, rather than what is truth.
It is. But you can imagine, you can still imagine what the culture is doing. The culture wants to remove every vestige of Christianity out of the public place, out of the public places. They don't want to picture baby Jesus in a manger down at the town square. So they're trying to remove all of that from the public setting. That's a cultural drift. 50 years ago, that would have been unheard of. Today, it's been normalized, and eventually, everything will be taken out of the public square. Yes.
I was just going to ask the Christmas trees, evergreens, isn't that, have some kind of pagan connotation originally?
I think everything that surrounds Christmas has a pagan.
Say every church has a Christmas tree
Sure.
in the front, but I think that was originated somehow.
Yeah.
And I saw in the news just the other day, there's some church, I can't remember where it is, they have a nativity scene out front, and they have the Mary and Joseph and the baby in cages in response to the immigration crisis and putting people in cages, and the idea being that what if Mary and Joseph, when they would have fled to Egypt, they wouldn't have let them in or locked them up and separated them. So they're using the nativity scene now to make a political statement, and it's in the church yard. I thought that was kind of interesting.
It is interesting. All right. Any questions on that? I think it's a lot more serious issue than we realize. And I think if you don't remember anything else that I've said tonight on syncretism, just remember that we are in a very real cultural shift. And that cultural shift will impact the church, right? It will impact the church and the church's message. We will syncretize these things into the fabric of our church. It's not that it will happen, it is happening. And eventually it will weaken the church. I want to talk next about postmodernism. I guess you may be thinking, why are all these things hermeneutical hazards? Because they impact our culture. And if the culture is impacted, the church is impacted, right? Postmodernism is a philosophy that basically states that absolute truth is non-existent. Now, everything that we believe is based on what we consider to be absolute truth, right? I believe in the scriptures. I believe that they teach absolute truth. So postmodernism is a movement. It's a very strong movement. It's very well integrated into our culture that says, I'm gonna give you some statistics on this here a little bit later, if I get that far, hopefully I will. That say that truth is non-existent. It's a view that says that all viewpoints except for Christianity, all other viewpoints are equally valid, right? That, you know, if it's right for you, it's okay. And so what this view has led to is the idea of relativism. That's sort of the term that I think you ought to just kind of get in, just absorb that term, relativism. And it simply means that truth is relative, right? Truth is fluid. Truth is flexible. Truth is changing. Truth adapts.
Your truth.
It's whatever you want truth to be. It can be, because truth is flexible. It's not something that is binding or absolute. And so what may be true for one person is not necessarily true or right for another person.
Then can you actually call it truth?
Well,
It's not factual.
that's a great
I mean-
comment. It's really a great comment, because truth is the very thing that postmodernism wants to deplete the culture of.
How do they argue against obvious natural laws? If you jump off a building, you're gonna fall to the ground. I mean, that's an absolute truth. How can they argue against that? That doesn't make any sense.
I don't think they can, all right? But it goes even further, Ed, in terms of rights. Postmodernism has gotten everybody involved in their personal rights. If I want to have an abortion, I can have an abortion. It's my right. It's my body. I can do that. And those rights are people say that they're okay until losing their rights impact them. Let's say, for instance, that, so if you take this idea that what may be true for you is not true for somebody else, right? So if you say, I believe in God, you say to me, I believe in God. I say, well, I don't believe in God. And so, you know, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. So what if you say, what if somebody says, what if some lost person out there says, that I don't believe it's right to steal. You know, we have laws that protect us. And somebody else comes along and says, hey, I think it's perfectly okay to steal. If I need something and you got it, I think it's okay for me to steal. So where do you come together on that? I mean, how does postmodernism deal with that situation? Because that happens every day.
I mean, it's a direct contradiction of the actual definition of truth. Truth is that whatever is being said is a fact and is a certainty. I mean, even if you go down to the basic of a true and false question, then you can technically say, according to postmodernism, there is no wrong answer to any true or false question, because it is what you think it is.
Well, the point I was going to make in this argument about the stealing is exactly that. Because if, let's say, for instance, I go into their house and I steal something, I steal their car, or I think it's perfectly okay. As far as I'm concerned, I can get my kicks by taking a hammer and busting all the windows in their car. Just bust them out. I like to have fun. And I believe that it's okay for me to do that. And he says, no, it's not okay for you to do that. What's the difference?
If there's no truth,
If anybody can be right, you know, Don and I talk about it all the time, there's no consistency in that position. Right? As you can do what you want to do as much as you want to do, but you won't let anybody else do to you what they may want to do to you, if I can say it that way.
But right and wrong, isn't it really, from their point of view, determined by the majority of the population. In other words, right and wrong laws prevent you from breaking into his house because the majority of the people have determined that's wrong, or abortion is wrong. But in terms of guilt, I don't think there's any guilt involved in that.
Well, I wouldn't say the majority of people agree that abortion is wrong.
But I mean,
But the
because
culture
of the
has
law,
shifted.
yeah, because of laws.
All right, well, who says that the laws are right? If I don't believe in that law. I don't believe in the Constitution. I don't believe that it's good. There are whole movements that are disagreeing with everything that is established in the church, in the Constitution, in our country, in the laws, right? And people say, well, I don't believe that. And postmodernism accepts that idea until it impacts that person. Understand what I just said? Until it impacts them. If somebody says it's okay for me to break your windows in your house and all the ones in your cars because I believe it's okay, they're going to say, no, you can't do that. You say, well, I believe that's okay. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of this. It's that everything is relative, everything is fluid, everything is flexible, everything is changing. There are no absolutes. Nobody's right. Nobody's right about anything or everything.
But that also means nobody's wrong.
That's exactly what it means. I mean, that's exactly what it means, is that nobody's wrong. Nobody can be wrong under postmodernism.
How do they build
There's
bridges?
no such thing.
They don't, it's, logic doesn't count. Reason doesn't count. Truth doesn't count in postmodernism. We have arrived.
Wow.
We live there. This is the environment in which your children are growing up. This is the environment that impacts the church. And if the culture, I'm just telling you that if the culture begins to shift, the church shifts with it. The one I'm going to preach at the end of this message, if I get through here, is that the church can't shift. The church has to stand. And if it creates persecution, if it creates conflict, so be it.
That persecuted me first.
So be it. So be it. If that's what it ultimately takes. So truth is relative to the individual and to a culture, to a particular belief system. One obvious example would be the issues related, let's say, to sexual morality. Right? I think the scriptures are clear, right? I think the scriptures are clear as to what's right and what's wrong. But if you don't accept that, if you don't accept absolute truth, then in the American culture, there is a very widespread movement to incorporate what I would consider to be all forms of sexual immorality into the culture as being legal. Whether it's lesbianism, homosexuality, the gay rights movement, the transgender, the bisexual, whatever it is that deals with morality, all of that is going to become legal. I don't know if you've been reading in the news that they are going to make prostitution legal in New York. That's the next big. That's one of the next big environments. They have movements in many of the states, and in New York, it's already a law that women can go bare-breasted in public. And so there are many states, because the women say, well, the men can go out in public without wearing a shirt. They can be on the beach without wearing a shirt, and we can see their breast. I'm not joking. And so now there are laws that are being written in many states. I would say probably a third of the states that allow for women to be bare-breasted anywhere they want to go. Not just the beach. In the city. In the workplace. It's what do we call it again? A what? A cultural drift. Okay, it's going to become accepted. It's going to become normal. It's going to be something that you see all the time. It's going to start to be on TV more. Right? Your children are going to see it. Your parishioners are going to see it. And so we have already reached the point where in many places we have redefined marriage, right? And now we want to bring that redefinition of marriage into the church. We want to allow, some denominations want to allow homosexuals to be pastors, women to be pastors. There's a large church, it's called in Charlotte, called River Hills. Very, very big church. And it was a mega church. They had I thought a good pastor. His name is David Chadwick. You can go out and look him up on the internet if you want to. He was a fairly conservative, fundamental pastor, and they had 5 other campuses, which I don't agree with, but they still had 5 other campuses, you know, where you go in, you don't have a pastor or such, you just watch a big screen TV up there, and then take up an offering, sing songs, or whatever they do. And so there was a large contingency of women in his church that felt like that they ought to have some women pastors at the other campuses. And he said, no. He said, no, I don't believe that. They can be servants, but we're not going to have them to be the pastors. And so there was a movement in the church to get rid of him, and they got rid of him. And asked him to leave and told him that we'll give you a severance package of 6 months or a year, whatever it was. And so some of the elders in his church came to him and said, look, but we don't agree with this. We think it was the wrong thing. We didn't agree with it. And so we want you to be our pastor. And so they decided to have a kind of a meeting to kind of, you know, what they would have to do to do this. It was just a word of mouth thing. Over 500 people showed up. And there were people in there that committed to financially helping this church to get started again. What was the issue for the church? Come on, tell me, what did I just say? What was the issue?
Cultural interference.
It was whether or not women could be pastors. Right? It was just a very simple issue. Why? Because in our culture, once again, 50 years ago, this wouldn't have been a problem. Right? But we've shifted so that now the Southern Baptists have actually shut down seminaries because of this one issue. Women in ministry. We're all for women. I'm all for women in ministry. But there's some absolutes where I feel like we have to maintain the dogma of Scripture on those issues. So obviously, this whole thing is a moral contradistinction to biblical teachings on both the sanctity of marriage and having sex outside of marriage. And yet the culture has, what? Shifted, drifted. And the church gets caught up in it. So what postmodernism would do is to simply say that these things may be seen as wrong for Christians, but that the Christian's belief should not prohibit it from being right for other people. Right? It may bring on persecution for the church. And my comment to that would be, probably hallelujah. Might be a good thing for the church. The first thing that's going to happen to the church is that if we are not willing to preach against these things, I mean, if we are willing to preach against these things, then the government is going to cut off the 501(c)(3).
Good. Excuse me.
No, I feel the same way. I feel the same way. It's okay with me. I'm still going to give. I don't care what the government does. It doesn't matter. The government, they can take it all away as far as I'm concerned. I don't need their donations. I mean, I don't need their, what's it called, in your taxes? You're
You know, the charitable donation.
I don't need their,
I tell you what that's gonna affect though, is where it's gonna affect is not really with the federal thing with the churches, because then churches most of the time don't make a profit, don't make income, you know. Where it's gonna affect is the property taxes. When the state, when the local government comes in, so like for example, Millbrook, we're sitting right here, corner of Whiskey Road and Pine Log, this multi-million-dollar complex. Can you imagine if all of a sudden Aiken County said, okay, property taxes are assessed? What in the world would that be on this budget? It would, there's a lot of churches are in prime locations that they would be, basically be shut down, I think, because they wouldn't be able to do it. Now, there may be a
And
good
wouldn't they
thing,
even
but-
be able to do like the rollback taxes? So it's not even just paying taxes on that. They'll go, okay, we're gonna tax you for multiple years that you haven't been taxed.
well, this has already happened in California.
Is it?
Yeah, it's already happened. In fact, there are certain places, especially in Los Angeles, where you cannot build a new church. You can only go to an existing facility. You cannot build a new church.
But that's, I just think that's gonna be the devastating effect, is gonna be the local property taxes, I think. That's my personal opinion. But, it may be a good thing, it may be worth it, and I don't know, but I'm just saying it's gonna shut down a lot of these churches that are just, bringing in enough to pay the preacher and keep the lights on. You know, if all of a sudden they're assessed, you know, tens of thousands of dollars for property taxes, or whatever it's gonna be, $500,000, whatever it's gonna be. Yeah, but anyway, but you're right, that's where it's going, because it's gonna be like, if you don't allow, you know, gay marriage in your facility, then you're gonna lose your 501(c)(3).
So, I think it would be utterly foolish on our part not to recognize that postmodernism is the preferred worldview, right? It is. It's not a biblical worldview. It's the preferred worldview of our culture. It dominates our culture. It dominates the media, right? It dominates the media. It dominates the educational system. You can't teach creation even as an alternative anymore in most churches. We have transgender bathrooms in some of the local schools to accommodate all of that. It dominates the political realm. We certainly know that, and as well as many segments of the church. It's not a Christian worldview, and what it values is a kind of false spirituality. It advocates a pluralism, which is the idea that anything goes. I say that that's the easiest way to define it. It exalts things being relative. It exalts science. It exalts the global family. It exalts individualism.
It exalts a tortured version of science. It doesn't exalt proper science.
Well, that's probably a good point. It exalts pragmatism. It exalts capitalism. It exalts sort of a subtle form of veneered religion, right? That denies the fundamentals of Christianity. And I think one of the core values of postmodernism is the simple fact that anytime any group, it doesn't matter what it is, some group, any group for that matter, tries to convince others that it is the sole possessor of truth, that what the group does is actually repress and oppress the culture in which it thrives. In other words, it's the idea that their idea of religion is that it's repressive, is that it's oppressive. All right? It's the idea that Christianity is oppressive. Let me put it that way. Forget religion. We're going to find that if Islam takes over, which it eventually will, they'll do it by numbers. They'll do it by birth or lack of birth control. The average family in the Islamic family is 8. The average family in the American family is like 1.3. It's just a matter of time. They've already done it in Europe. They've done it in Germany. They create a caliphate, all right? They're smarter than we are. You know, God said to be fruitful and multiply, and they believed Him. And have headed off in that direction. And so, stated another way, the cornerstone of postmodernism is actually the rejection of absolute truth. It's the cornerstone of what they actually believe. And so in the postmodern era, there actually is no truth. Truth can be whatever somebody wants it to be. Now, why is all this important for hermeneutics? I mean, hermeneutics is down to the nuts and bolts, right? And the principles of studying the scriptures and syntax and composition and parsing of verbs and cases of nouns and all of that kind of stuff. It is. But it doesn't do us any good if we get all of that right and we still don't take care of the things that are happening right in our own midst. Because what we're talking about here affects the way that people teach and preach. It affects the hermeneutics of their messages and what they're willing to say and what they're not willing to say. I would say, and I think this is a good way to say it, I would say that postmodernism is a global war on truth, where truth is just relative. It can be anything that somebody wants it to be. And so at its very core, postmodernism just simply rejects biblical truth. You have to appreciate that. And it wants to impose that value on the culture. So the way that Christians get labeled is that we are oppressive, is that we are intolerant, bigots, we are arrogant, and all of that. We're seen as being prejudiced, we're seen as being chauvinistic, right? They have a new program on TV called the L Word. I mean, it's just advertised. I've never seen it, and I'm not going to watch it. But you know what the L Word stands for? The L Word stands for lesbianism. And so the only reason I know about this is that the other day we were watching, my wife and I were eating, and we were watching Good Morning America, which is a very liberal thing. I don't know why I was even watching it. And they had a lady that was she's sort of one of the advocates for lesbianism. I forget what her name was. And she was being interviewed by another lady that is a lesbian. And she was saying how much she appreciated that that through this program that she had brought all of these issues to the forefront. And, you know, I mean, it made it sound like it was a good thing. And all the people that are on the program and all the people that are part of it are involved in that lesbian community. And they bring in the gay guys and the transgender and everything. This is not something that's fun to talk about, is it? We can't get rid of it. It's here. It's here. We have to learn how to deal with it in our churches. And what, you know, what God's, you gotta love the sinner, right? But you can still dislike the sin. And so they see us as being condescending. They see that we are culturally stifling to somebody's personality. These are sort of the outworkings of postmodernism. And the problem that the church has is that this philosophy, it opens the door for pluralism, right? And pluralism is the belief that there are many ways to heaven. Anything goes. You can get to heaven this way, you can get to heaven that way, You don't have to believe like I believe. You don't have to believe what the Bible says. Oprah says you can go to heaven without, in a different way, right? Whether it's works or whatever it may be. And so it just fully rejects that Christ is the only way to God, and thus it opens the door for many, many false religions. So Christianity is just simply reduced to an opinion. It's reduced to an opinion versus biblical, absolute, moral truth. It's just your opinion against somebody else's opinion. Now, I want you to appreciate that what's called the Renaissance, and the Renaissance happened between the 14th century and the 17th century, and especially what occurred in what's known as the Enlightenment, or they actually defined it as the Age of Reason, which happened in the 17th and 18th century, I believe, or through the 19th century. During that time, they developed a humanistic philosophy that reversed the idea that life in the world revolved around God to a philosophy that life in the world revolved around the individual. So it went from being God-centered to being man-centered. That was a part of the Enlightenment. Is that man is sort of at the pinnacle here, and reason became the accepted substitute for doctrine and biblical truth. Now that's an important statement. That reason, that logic, became the substitute for biblical truth. Human values replaced religious values. And so reason, the individual and reason took center stage during this particular period. If you took something like supernatural Christianity, it was dismissed as just being an artifact of ancient beliefs that were not true and didn't have any value or any worth. And so once the idea of a supernatural God, once that idea was removed, right, from the discussion, everything else seemed to be more explainable, and problems at that point could now be resolved by science and by reason. So sin was defined as being archaic, being antiquated, and out of date. Now, here's what happened. The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason that happened in the 17th and 19th centuries were very, very strong. And they had a tremendous philosophical impact on the church at that time. And along came World War I, and then came World War II, and then came the Korean War, and everything that was associated with all of that. We had the Holocaust, we had the Vietnam War. I mean, I don't know how many people were killed in all of these wars put together. We had the Great Depression that happened. And it was during those periods when everybody thought that everything was going to get better, science and reason are going to prevail, that they became discouraged. I mean, and people and leaders in the church became very, very discouraged by what was happening. They now had weapons of mass destruction. There was global pollution everywhere. There was rampant starvation all over the world. People began to indulge in drugs and the occult and mysticism. It was a very, very large reaction to all of the things that were happening. And then came the sexual revolution, right? Playboy, some of those magazines, I don't even know what they're called anymore. They came on the scene, burlesque, striptease, all those kind of things. Homosexuality and abortion were legalized. Pornography became rampant. I mean, we're just moving right along, aren't we? I mean, these things are so normal to us anymore that we don't realize how powerful they actually are in the culture. We have divorce. Divorce has almost become expected in marriages today. Even within the church. My understanding is that 50% of people that are married in the churches are divorced. I did a head count on that one time in my church, and it was true, of the people that had actually been divorced. And so then rushes in postmodernism, right? There's a vacuum that's been created here with all of these negative things that have taken place, and it gives rise to the complete rejection of authorial intent in the Scriptures. It just completely rejects it. Just completely rejects that idea. And it not only rejected human reason, but it also rejected the values of Christianity, the morals of Christianity, and it replaced them with the concepts of humanism. Right? That's what it did. It created a religion of humanism. That the individual is, one of the neat things that I've enjoyed about going to Africa is that over there they have a tribal mentality. Here in America we have an individual mentality. But over there they have a very tribal mentality. And the tribal chief runs everything. You don't do anything. You don't go to town if he doesn't want you to go. I'm serious. I'm not kidding. And the reason that they need that mentality is for survival. If they didn't have a tribal mentality, they couldn't survive. They need one another. They need one another desperately. They don't have food. They don't have water. They don't have good shelter. They don't have protection. They don't have anything. They have to help each other build the fences that surround their compounds. They build them out of wood, that they gather the sticks that they gather from everywhere. They've got to learn how to battle the elephants and the wild animals that invade their compounds. They use dried out jalapenos, those kind of things. What's another word for all that? They take those kind of
Dehydrated.
Well, they take them and when the animal, they keep at night, they burn. They have fires that burn all around their place, and they throw these. They throw these things. I'm going to say jalapenos. I forget what the term is I'm looking for. They throw them into the fire and they go off like guns. To sort of they keep the dogs up all night, and somebody normally is up at night. Somebody has to stand guard. And so I think when humanism came along, I was saying all that because I like the idea that there's an authority in the tribe that helps to protect the tribe. So they eliminated any concept of truth, any concept of values, any concepts of righteousness. And so they had two philosophers, two chief philosophers. I won't give you their name. The first guy's name was, this is interesting to me, these were the two, if you go back and do the history on this, these were the two chief postmodern philosophers. One guy's name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, you probably heard of Nietzsche, N-E-I-T, I think it's Z-S-C-H-E, and another guy by the name of Michael Foucault. And both died in their 50s of AIDS and venereal disease. And one of them became insane from the venereal disease. So much for free thinking and no values, right? That's sort of where it leads you. Now, you may be asking yourself, you may be asking this question, and probably legitimate, why, Gary, what in the world does all of this have to do with hermeneutics? Well, it has everything to do with it. And the reason is because of this cultural drift in the church. The truth has almost become kind of what I call sort of a cultural blur, if you would, with entertainment. Today, it's more of the gospel of pragmatism, what works, than it is a gospel of truth. We've blurred everything. There's so much entertainment going on in the church today that we've lost the value of truth in the church. In the church. And so image and style are much more important than substance, right? You know, every time I drive by one of these simple little metal buildings for a church, I go, hallelujah. They're not spending a lot of money on a building, right? And then I go by an emergent church with all the angles and the circles and the odd-looking buildings and everything that goes with them, the huge facilities that they have, the colors, everything that's on the inside, and it's like image is much more important than substance to us. It's a way of attracting people. It's much more about nickels and noses, that's the term that Eddie's always used, than it is about conviction. How many people can we get in? What have I taught you in the past?
Physical revenue.
That's right. People, numbers equal revenue. Churches need revenue. They built so much. The taxes will get bad for churches that have a big revenue. To most people, preaching is boring, and strong doctrinal teaching just puts people to sleep. Literally. It just preaches. You go through Romans, it's going to put everybody to sleep. I think they go to church more for the emotional experience and to feel the music more than the pursuit of biblical truth. To me, that's a preaching problem. And then to make matters worse, the church has issued this call to just simply make a decision. Right? Just make a decision. You know, everybody close your eyes. I see that hand. Come on down, take a preacher's hand, sign a card, get baptized, join the church. And now we got nickels and noses, right? They don't ask them to become a devoted follower of Christ. And no wonder the Bible speaks about a falling away and a great apostasy within the church. I think all of this is the continuing influence of the postmodern mindset on the culture of the church. Now, one of the major problems that confronts biblical Christianity with the influence of postmodernism on the culture is that many young people have to swim against these currents, right? They're out there. They're out there in the culture, in the way that the kids dress, in what goes on in the public schools. I think what even goes on in churches, in youth groups. We have Christian schools, and you can go to many Christian schools that have grades 1 through 12, and it's not any different than a high school, than a regular educational system. Nothing changes. They all wear the same kind of clothes. They all have the same kind of toys. They all got their phones. It's all of that. And so, in the schools and in the workplaces that these young people attend, these false values are being promoted. And if they're not strong, listen to me, if they're not strong in their faith and in their convictions, they will just be swept up by the entire postmodern culture that surrounds us today. They will just be drowned intellectually and completely. Their faith will be completely undermined in Jesus Christ. Just watch the movies, right? Just watch the television programs and all the newscasts that people, how this damning philosophy of postmodernism has inundated the culture. I'm saying to you that it's inundated the church culture in which we live. And I think the sad part is that what I would consider to be the nominal, the conservative, the institutional church that's out there that may have very good intentions. Everybody's got good intentions about what it is that they're doing and all that it offers. They've not been able to successfully prepare their young people for the postmodern environment. It would not be a stretch of my personal imagination to assume that many young people in the upcoming generation have never even heard of the issue or given a second thought to it, to the issue of postmodernism. They don't know what it is. They don't have a word for it. They've just grown up in it. It's normal to them. It'd be abnormal to be anything else. And so statistics have clearly shown that the vast majority of young people today do not believe in absolute truth. I have some other numbers. I probably won't get to them tonight, but I'll give them to you next week. And they're staggering. They're numbers that are frightening to me as a pastor. Even the vast majority of young people don't believe in absolute truth. And I would say that one of the statistics that we're going to look at is how many adults, let me back up, I want to say it this way, how many people that are considered to be conservative evangelical Christians believe in absolute truth. It's well below 50%, trust me. It's well below 50%. It's not even half of the people. And some of the statistics indicate that it's only like, some of them might say 40, some of them might say 20. Just divide it in half. Just divide it in half and come up with 30% if you want to. So if the parents don't believe in absolute truth, how in the world would the children ever believe in it? And as they get away from the home, as they get away from their roots, they get away from their moorings, they have no convictions about these things. Even the adults don't want to hear about absolutes. Most people don't want to go to a place where they have strong preaching. It's too restrictive, too oppressive. I think there are a lot of places where people believe that the churches ought to open its doors up to the gay lifestyle. It's just here. It's just here. Let's do it. Let's be more tolerant of these socially accepted lifestyles that are very prevalent today, and those professing believers who have no real time for commitment to the things of God or to the church. I want you to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 through 5. Right? This is a passage that you're familiar with. I think this is one of the cures for the church. It's really very simple. 2 Corinthians 10. It says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." No teacher will ever be able to pull down these strongholds and cast down these diabolical arguments that the culture inflicts on us if we don't know what the truth is. If we're not grounded in the truth, right? We were talking today. We were coming in to go eat supper, Don and I were, and we were talking about the fact that many of the men that are in pulpits today have no formal education. Remember I gave you a statistic? 81% in Southern Baptist churches. In Northern Baptist churches, that's the African American community. 81% of everybody that stands in a pulpit on Sunday, this coming Sunday morning, has no formal training of any kind. If you knew how many churches we had, the valley down here is in Ripley's, believe it or not, is having the most churches per capita of any place in the world. And if you go through there, you go through Gloverville, Highlandville, how many villes are there? Granitesville, Warrenville, this ville, that ville. Every one of them's got a First Baptist church, a Methodist church, a Catholic church, a this church, a that church, a Pentecostal church, a who knows what kind of church. And I guarantee you that 90% of the people that are preaching in those churches have no training whatsoever. And so unless we accept the idea that for the most part the culture in which we live has rejected the idea of absolute truth, if we don't accept that, if we don't realize that, then we'll never be able to reach them. I have to develop some kind of apologetic approach, right? I have to develop some kind of apologetic approach to help reach these people. That's our job. That's what God's called us to do. And so we've got to develop that approach, not just in our teaching and in our preaching. We've got to develop that approach of how to reach somebody in that scenario. They surround us. It's going to get worse. It's not going to get any better. It's a good thing for the church in my mind. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be a good thing. There's going to be a reckoning as to who the real Christians are.
It'll refine the church.
It is. It will refine the church. So every idea and every notion, every philosophy is just absolute straw when it's compared to the absolute truth of Scripture. But none of that matters. Listen to me, men. None of that matters if we don't know how to communicate the truth to that culture. Right? If we don't know how to communicate the very things that we believe in a meaningful way, that was the problem that we were talking about in your class, is that we serve a creator God. He's the creator God. He's sovereign. What was the term that you used? That he has the authority. He's a God that has authority to make demands on people's lives. And so we have to teach and preach a biblical worldview that expounds on the sovereignty of God, on the absolute nature of biblical truth, and the fraudulent nature of all of these man-made philosophies such as postmodernism. I was thinking that we have to be smart, right? We have to be well-grounded. We have to be intelligent about how we go about all of this stuff. And we have to be well prepared. I don't think the church is prepared for anything. I just don't think it's prepared. Churches are declining. I don't care what kind of numbers you look at. There's no, I don't think that most of the children, I'm not saying every child, I'm not saying that. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but many of the children in our churches, they don't have convictions. They just get drawn into their culture, which is a very postmodern culture. And so we've got to be prepared to stand in the face of these damning arguments and philosophies. Now, I think what's so important about how we address the postmodern issue is relatively simple. And what postmodernism does is to state that words are incapable of defining objective truth, right? That it's not possible for us to communicate objective truth. Now, I want to give you a term, okay? This is a hermeneutical term. It's a bad term. And this philosophy has been developed and is being developed. It's called deconstruction. Deconstruction. It's the deconstruction of language. The deconstruction of language, which simply means that any document, whether it be the Constitution or it be the Bible, does not have a fixed meaning and is therefore open to unlimited and uncontrolled interpretations. I'm going to say that again. It means that any document, no matter what it is, the Bible, Constitution, does not have a fixed meaning and is therefore open to unlimited and uncontrolled interpretations. So, when you place this in a biblical perspective, it's the deconstruction of absolute truth. Or how does somebody determine the difference between what is right and what is wrong? How do you make that determination? How does somebody actually do that? So we have a new moral code that's being developed, right? Everybody understand that? We have a new moral code that's being inflicted on us as individuals, whether we want it or not. Marriage is being redefined. The cultural, the sexual revolution is rampant. It's rampant in our schools. I mean, there are surveys that have been done to indicate that probably nearly 50% of all kids that are in high school have already had premarital sex. We have kids that are in the 9th grade, 8th grade, 7th grade. Their parents are already giving them birth control pills. Unbelievable. I'm not kidding. So, this comes from a culture that rejects absolute truth. And we are seen as being irrelevant, right? Your message is seen as being irrelevant and really something that is extreme.
Our message is being seen as hostile.
It is hostile. I mean, it is hostile to them. I mean, it tells them to quit. I want to give you some information on surveys. They've consistently shown that anyone who holds to the dogma of absolute truth is in a minority. Even among strong evangelicals and people who call themselves born-again Christians, moral and absolute truth is only believed by 40% of the people. Now, I gave you the high number of the various statistics that I went out and did research on. 40% was the high number. It came from one place. So I gave it the benefit of the doubt. I think it's less than that. Maybe 30% at best. And only about 10% of the young people and the teenagers believe in absolute truth. Then to make matters even worse, listen to this statistic.
What group is that? Evangelical Christians?
Yes. Then to make matters worse, only 1% of what they consider to be the youngest adult generation believes in a biblical worldview. So if you go back, if you take it down further and get it out of the adults, it's the youngest. The guys that are 12 and 13 and 14 and 15. Only 1% of them believe in absolute truth. You say, well, man, I got a lot of good kids in my church. Yeah, but you got a lot of kids that go to every one of these schools around here that don't even go to church. Then to make matters worse, let me say it this way. I tried to define what is a biblical worldview, okay? You could change this if you want to, but I want to give you the way that I defined it. I defined it as, I had a help from a guy by the name of Riley, that it could be defined, that you could define a biblical worldview as believing that absolute moral truth exists, that what the Bible teaches is both true and accurate, that Satan is a real force in the world, and that Jesus Christ is the only means by which a person can be saved. Absolute truth exists. What the Bible teaches is true and accurate. Satan is a real force in the world, and Jesus Christ is the only means by which a person can be saved. If the reality, just think for this a minute, if the reality is that 99% of the younger generation does not hold to a biblical worldview, and you project that belief out into their adult lifetime, whatever that is, however many years that is from now, it simply means that Christianity will have no sustainable basis for furthering the gospel. I think what it means is that most of the people in our present churches, and the vast majority of Christian parents and the churches they attend, they appear to have no real focus on helping their kids obtain a biblical worldview. Just don't have it. Just not teaching it. They're not teaching it in church. They're teaching them about Samson, and they're teaching them about David and Goliath, and they're teaching them about the Red Sea, and but they're not teaching these deeper things that probably need to be defined.
Probably equating those stories to Aesop's fables as well.
I think if you just tell them stories, I mean, there's a point where you have to tell them stories. I mean, you can't teach a 4-year-old doctrine and stuff.
No.
But as they grow, somehow they've got to be brought in, they've got to be given a stronger worldview.
Yes, I've thought before, some of these other denominations and things have, I think they have something correct. I think in the catechisms and different things that the kids have to go through before they become part of the church. It's kind of expected them to go through certain training. I mean, I'm not familiar with what that training is, but you know, as opposed to the Baptist denomination where you have to do nothing other than just walk down the aisle and shake the preacher's hand.
Right.
There is a certain level of expectation for doctrinal understanding in their denomination, like Lutherans and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of denominations where the children have to go through catechisms and creeds and that kind of stuff.
And though we may not agree with it, it can definitely be appreciated because it's ingrained in who they are as adults. A lot of them never actually stray away from what they were originally raised under the catechism and those creeds because it's really embedded in their DNA, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the Baptist denomination has done a really, really poor job of that. We're more concerned about nickels and noses than we are conviction, and we've just lost sight of it. I think that the postmodern mindset is having a much more significant impact on the cultural makeup of the local church setting than we actually realize. And I think, and it's just my opinion, I think that it may already have created an irreversible trend. I mean, I really do. I think that the population issue I was mentioning about 1.3 versus 8 is irreversible at this point. That it is just irreversible. And even a lot of the Hispanics that come here, they have much larger families.
Our very own government, though, has done a lot of damage.
Sure, we just kill people. We just kill children.
Well,
That's what we think about children, is that they are a nuisance, and we need to get rid of them.
Men are just incentivized to marry and have kids because of the enormous burden of, you know, there's no financial incentive to stay married, and if the woman wants to leave, then the guy's responsible for paying for everything. So why risk that burden?
Yeah, but there are a lot of people that don't get married and they get money from the government because of it to raise their kids.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop there. It could be discouraging, everybody.
What did you cover, 2 terms?
I did.
Flying through this.
Biblical
So we're flying through it. Cover 2 terms tonight.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna, the next one is polysemy. I'll tell you what it means next week. All right, anybody have any questions or comments?
Now, is next week our last class?
It is. All right, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll be dismissed. And you cut that off for me. Father, we thank you again for tonight. We talked about some things that are probably not pleasant, not fun, not, but things that impact us, impact our families, our children, our churches, our culture. We see that the trend, Lord, could be irreversible, but we are not people without hope. Even if difficult times come for the church, it's probably a good thing. And rather than running from it, Lord, we need to be willing to embrace it and to let our convictions and just what we call our light, Lord, to shine, be a testimony of the truth. Father, we know that people that are without Christ, that deep down inside, that they're actually miserable. They're people that have no hope. They're just living for the moment. Sometimes life just ends quickly. It's such a fallacy for us to think that we'll live a long time. That may not be the case. And so I pray that for each of us as men, as leaders in our churches, as Christians, that you would create in us, Lord, a deep, deep conviction, not only to maintain our Christian worldview, but to be able to communicate it properly and accurately to people that we meet that are opposed to it. And to be able to do it in a way, Lord, that just dogmatic and arrogant and oppressive to people, but in a way that demonstrates your love and your concern for their life. I pray that you would give us grace as we do that we would be good ministers of the gospel and men who are faithful to its message. We love you deeply now. We just pray that you would strengthen each one of these men as they leave and be with them and their families this week and protect them and keep them. And I pray, Father, that your Spirit would guide us, control our lives. It's in Jesus' precious name that we pray.